regulations require each air monitoring program, that includes APCD, to submit to US EPA an air monitoring network plan annually for the coming year. Additionally, each air monitoring program must complete a 5-year network assessment and submit that to US EPA. APCD's ambient air monitoring network undergoes periodic reviews to determine if additional monitoring sites are needed or if existing sites have met their monitoring objectives and may be discontinued on both an annual and a 5-year basis. Factors that influence changes to that network include new EPA regulations, changes in population, an evaluation of sensitive populations, changes in emission sources, and that new national ambient air quality standard when EPA determines that a lower standard is necessary to protect public health and the environment. That annual ambient air monitoring network plan then actually, and forgive me, my slide has an error in it. The annual ambient air monitoring network plan takes the planning from that 5-year plan and it implements it. There you'll find where we make a recommendation either to add a new monitor. It'll be shown in that annual monitoring network plan as the physical implementation of that 5-year forward-looking assessment. And sometimes you'll also see where we either recommend in the 5-year ambient air monitoring plan decommissioning an air monitoring site or moving it. Next slide, please. So just as we do this here for Louisville, Jefferson County, which is our core-based statistical area, or CBSA, our partner agencies, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, the Kentucky Division for Air Quality, do the same thing in their jurisdictions. And that includes those that ring our urban core, Clark and Floyd in Indiana, Bullitt and Oldham in Kentucky. This process lets us, the air pollution control agencies and EPA, know that the monitors that we operate are appropriately placed to collect data to evaluate compliance with those national ambient air quality standards and continue to protect public health and the environment. So the monitors there that you see in green, those are monitors that APCD operates. The monitors in blue to the north in New Albany and Charlestown are IDEMs. And then, of course, LaGrange and Shepherdsville are our partners at DAQ's monitors to run. Next slide, please. So what do we do with all this? We get a lot of information, and our agency generates a lot of information, as do our partners. In particular, we have air quality data. We have emissions and emissions-related data. These are the sources we regulate. We know what comes out. They report that to us. We prepare an emissions inventory. But when we get down to doing that ozone nonattainment designation, US EPA takes into account a whole lot of things, including looking at the area where the monitor is violating the standard, casting a wide net, and then narrowing down to be sure that they have accounted for other air pollution sources that contribute to the problem. And so for us, for our 2015 ozone standard, there's a document called the Kentucky, Indiana, Louisville Technical Support Document for the 2015 ozone standard, where EPA walks through their evaluation of all these factors. And they really do a very thorough job, just as APCD does when it looks at its 5-year monitoring assessment. They evaluate air monitoring data, the population density and the degree of urbanization, traffic and vehicle miles traveled to determine the non-attainment area boundaries and identify those other CBSAs that should be included in the designation, because at that point, we're all required to take steps to bring the entire area into attainment. So we continue to work together as APCD and our partner agencies to apply and enforce regulations that kind of level the playing field. We've done a non-attainment new source review submittal to US EPA as part of our marginal non-attainment work to date. That program requires companies to take extra reductions so that they don't add to the pollution problem. And it requires those counties that ring us to meet that standard as well. And there are other Clean Air Act programs, Byron will talk to you about some of those here in a few minutes, that also help put us on a more level playing field on a regional basis. And those include things like regional haze and other good neighbor rules. So with that background, let's get to RFG. Why do we still have RFG? It's a great question. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide that shows where RFG is required to be used as part of the 1997 Ozone standard. So Louisville and parts of Bullitt and Oldham counties rely on RFG as part of the plan for maintaining that 1997 8-hour ozone standard. Today, RFG use reduces about 35 tons of VOCs and 37 tons of nitrogen oxides. And those VOCs, again, are volatile organic compounds. Those two are our precursor pollutants to form ozone during ozone season. RFG also, to a smaller extent, reduces some mobile source air toxics, including benzene and 1,3-butadiene. But the amount that it reduces both those volatile organic compounds and the nitrogen oxides and those very important air toxics has been reduced over time because, frankly, gasoline has gotten cleaner. So conventional gas is now cleaner, and the benefit from RFG is reduced in comparison. That said, it's the only mobile source control measure that we have locally. The reason that you see those branches extending into Bullitt and Oldham counties is because that's the transportation corridor. And this is a transportation related issue. So as a required control measure under the Federal Clean Air Act and our state implementation plan, or our SIP, in order to drop that control measure, APCD would need to, first and foremost, formally petition EPA. This would require US EPA approval. And we would need to demonstrate that there are enough equivalent reductions in both volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide to offset the increase in pollution that would result if we eliminated RFG. So if we switched from RFG to conventional gas, or even the Reed vapor pressure gas that's used in Clark and Floyd County, we would have to come up with new reductions and control measures on top of any that we currently have in place. And these new reductions would need to be quantifiable, surplus, permanent, and enforceable due to the anti-backsliding provision of the Clean Air Act, or as Byron and I unfortunately call it 110L, but that's usually followed by an H and an E on the L part. Just saying, it's a tricky provision because it requires us to demonstrate with near mathematic precision that eliminating a control measure will not push us into non-attainment. So at this point, friends, we're in non-attainment. The bar is very, very high. EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality estimates that the actual cost for RFG is roughly 3 to 6 cents per gallon. What we see sometimes at the pump is the influence of market forces. So we're an urban area, there's high demand, and as a transportation corridor, sometimes it seems that our gas prices are much higher than surrounding areas. It's not all because of RFG, it is also because of market forces. Next slide, please. So again, what you can see here is that on-road mobile sources contribute almost as much nitrogen oxides as the sources that APCD regulates. From a stationary source standpoint, that point source are those things that you think of that we typically regulate. Sources like LG&E, sources like rubber tin. So it's a large contributor. It's also a fairly large contributor for nitrogen oxides. So with that in mind, as regulators, attaining the public health-based national ambient air quality standard for ozone is our primary goal. This goal is also shared by members of the Mobile Source Committee of the Multi-Pollutant Stakeholder Group, who recommended that we keep reformulated gas in use in the ozone non-attainment area if analysis shows continued emission reduction benefits. And to date, it does. They ask that we reanalyze the benefit after the area comes into attainment of the ozone standard, and we wholeheartedly agree with that recommendation. The multi-pollutant stakeholder process, which you'll hear more about today from Byron and Michelle, is another way that APCD evaluates, plans, and develops strategies to implement steps to improve air quality and reduce health impacts from air pollution. As you may remember, the group brought together business officials from key sectors, community leaders, relevant government, academic, and health representatives. They met several times as a full group and in subject-specific committees in late 2019 and early 2020, and they looked at that air quality data modeling and regulatory requirements to develop recommendations like the one for RFG for further emission reductions. So as you see, they have taken a very local look at the same data that we look at in partnership with IDEM, DAQ, and US EPA to make recommendations to improve our air quality. So with that snapshot, I'm going to turn it over to Byron and Michelle.
Thanks, Rachel. This is Byron. One of the other questions we got is about how we monitor or know about the impact from sources outside of Jefferson County. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do know what sources are out there, as well as one of the recommendations from the Multi-Stakeholder Group Point Committee, that we sort of track the known and planned shutdowns going out into the future so we can sort of take account for hopeful reductions coming up. So there are a number of different emissions inventories that we look to when we're doing our work. One of them is that national emissions inventory, the second bullet point here, which was shown on that last slide in Rachel's presentation. That was data for Bullitt, Oldham, and Jefferson counties in Kentucky. And it really showed how close that second group there, the on-road NOx and VOCs, is to the point source NOx and VOCs in that non-attainment area. We also, as an agency, require large point sources to submit annually to us. That NEI is triennial, so the most recent one right now is for 2017. They're developing 2020. But we also require sources, major sources, to submit annual emissions inventories to us of those criteria pollutants such as NOx and VOCs, as well as hazardous air pollutants, as well as toxic.
And is that strictly Jefferson County?
There are equivalent regulations in DAQ and IDEM areas. In particular, the next bullet point, the sources with greater than 25 tons per year of NOx or VOCs. As a non-attainment area, we are required to have those sources submit to us annually. So DAQ has an equivalent regulation and collects those annually, and IDEM does as well. For areas that are in attainment, we're only required to collect triennially. We collect annually pursuant to our regulations, and DAQ does as well. I'm not certain about IDEM for the attainment areas where they collect annually. But there are other requirements for sources to submit annually, particularly those largest sources. They are usually subject to cap and trade programs for NOx due to interstate pollution problems. So they actually submit to EPA hourly emissions on a quarterly basis. So each quarter, they actually submit their hourly emissions for NOx in particular, which is the larger contributor to ozone. And that's for throughout the region incorporated Kentucky, Indiana, and everything northeast of us due to those ozone problems in the northeast. EPA also develops emissions modeling platforms. These are used for the sort of modeling that we conducted here in Louisville as part of the ozone information study that you may recall a couple of years ago. The most recent one is the 2016 version 1 platform. And EPA also uses these and develops projections. That 2016 version 1 modeling platform has projections out to 2023 to 2028 based on their planning modeling. So not just the modeling of emissions, but they actually model things like energy demand and transport and things well beyond our usual daily life, such as the grid and needs there, and project out where they believe there will be shutdowns. And they use that modeling for things like that interstate transport that I was talking about. There are certain requirements under the Clean Air Act that areas reach attainment by certain deadlines, and that other areas not contribute more than a certain amount to an exceedance in the future. So EPA, as part of that, has modeled out to 2021, 2023, and 2028 to show that areas within the cross-state air pollution rule area, or the CSAPR, number of different ways to pronounce that one, the areas that states within that task group area are not contributing more than 0.07 parts per billion to a violation somewhere else. So the idea being you can't contribute more than 1% to somebody else's problem. Otherwise, you've got to cause reductions to help them get into attainment as well. So they have these modeling platforms. As I mentioned, we used one to conduct that modeling here in Louisville. The Ramball Corporation did that modeling for us, conducted it to determine the sensitivity to NOx and VOC emissions reductions, and ultimately determined, as you see here, that NOx reductions on the left would be much more effective. So the darker blue represents the greater reduction in ozone we would get from reductions in either NOx on the left or VOC on the right. So VOC certainly contributes, and VOC reductions would definitely help in the area, but NOx reductions of an equivalent amount would help a great bit more. And this was across an area represented here. This is a map of the modeling domain used for that study, and those red circles are the point sources within that modeling domain. We modeled the impact of NOx reduction from all anthropogenic sources. These are just the large point sources, but on-road sources and non-point sources, as well as non-road sources across this entire domain as well. And that impact on the previous slide would be a 25% reduction in either NOx or VOCs, what they would project the reduction in ozone would be. So this is one way that we knew that a reduction across the board in the area would be helpful. That wasn't source apportionment modeling, so we can't say how much a particular source or state or county or anything like that contributed. But reductions across this entire area would help and have helped. I also mentioned that CSAPR rule. It was just finalized in a revised version earlier this year. The most recent cross-state air pollution rule is still dealing with the 2008 standard, helping upwind states such as New York and Connecticut who haven't quite made it there to get to attainment by the deadline for them. The deadline coming up is 2021, so they were required to revise it by court decisions to make sure that there were reductions this year. So they revised the budgets for upwind states such as Kentucky and allocated an even smaller budget to Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio to help states get there in 2021. Previously, they had been modeling out to just 2023, and no more is needed because we're going to get there anyway. So those 12 states were required to cut an additional 17,000 tons this year of NOx. This is that task group area. In blue are states that they believe are contributing to a problem somewhere else. So as you see, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, et cetera, we're all contributing to a problem up in Connecticut in this modeling season. Hopefully they'll get to that 75 parts per billion standard. Louisiana is sort of an outlier there. It's actually contributing to a problem in Texas. So additional reductions were required there as well. And those green states have budgets already, but they determined that they were not contributing over that threshold. So no additional reductions were required by those green states. In that tax for rural update, they also modeled throughout that area to determine what states and areas, they did that source apportionment modeling to determine how much would be contributed to violations and other monitors. Now, our Canopy lane monitor is already achieving that 2008 standard, so reductions were required from other states that will want to get into attainment. But they did model that Canopy lane monitor anyway and determine these are the contributions of other areas to the ozone in that area. So that first bar at the top, IC/BCs, is intercontinental/background conditions. So this is just the ozone floating around in our atmosphere worldwide all the time, and that contributed almost 18 parts per billion to our current design value of 69. Kentucky sources contributed another 17.9 ppb. So that's the second biggest. Our background is actually bigger than the contribution from sources in Kentucky. Beneath that is biogenics at 8.68. So that's everything from trees to lightning to soil decomposition. That all contributes almost 9 parts per billion. And that's followed up by a number of states. I show everything here that contributed greater than 0.75 parts per billion. Indiana is the greatest contributor at 6 parts per billion, and Ohio 5.6. I'm taking these extra decimal points, but this is a little bit of a fuzzy.
And these represent contributions to Jefferson County's ozone number?
Jefferson County's modeled ozone levels. So they modeled us at about 67 parts per billion. So they modeled us a little lower this year than we're actually going to be. But at the modeled level, these are the contributions to that total amount of 67 parts per billion.
How do they get downwind state contributions like Ohio, as an example?
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive to the Northeast having a problem with downwind or upwind.
I should have included a slide showing the high slip. So there's really complicated meteorology, and actually the highest ozone days tend to be the days where we see stagnant winds, where it'll blow this way and then back this way, and it just floats over the area, and it captures ozone from Cincinnati and brings it back down, and then captures something from over St. Louis, and it's just back and forth. It's upwind in that a certain amount of the time, wind patterns do blow the troposphere down from Ohio or Indiana to Kentucky and Louisville. And in particular on those highest ozone days, because those are the days we don't have those consistent winds out of the southeast that we usually think of as our predominant wind pattern, and that would tend to blow everything right out of the area and just keep going.
So our prevailing wind direction is basically south, southeast?
South-southeast.
Okay.
Generally, it's the prevailing wind pattern, but it does mix up a whole lot more than that.
Is it not really southwest?
What's that?
Isn't it, southwest, northeast?
I'm sorry, south-southwest to the northeast.
Oh, okay.
I'm mistaken, sorry. Yes, it tends to blow from here up towards New York City, basically, if you could draw a predominant wind pattern, but it mixes up a lot more than that. And when we do those back trajectories, we do tend to see swirling and coming from all sorts of weird different directions. We even get impacts from the wildfires up in Canada sometimes. So we've been hearing a great bit in the news and hear about EPU coal closures in particular. There have been a variety of factors, but you see these headlines all the time from S&P Global and the Hill to the New York Times about how coal is on the decline on the whole. This is a variety of factors. Regulatory is only one of those, things like the CSAPR rule or the mercury air toxics rule. Also the anticipation that there may be carbon regulation coming at some point in the future. But other factors too, just market forces, just like with RFG prices. Natural gas has been consistently cheaper than coal, so it's just not economical. And renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. They are nearing the point of being more economical even without subsidies than coal. So it's getting to the point where as utilities look out into the future, they make that decision based on known and anticipated market forces as well as regulatory costs. And some of them are also just almost say out of the goodness of their hearts, but they are increasingly coming under scrutiny and having to take sustainability into account just as part of their corporate plan,
Right.
As well as demand for large companies like Google and Amazon, who are increasingly having their own renewable portfolios where they are not locating in places where coal is the predominant energy source. And this is projected to continue for some time. These are known and planned closures of coal plants compiled by S&P Global. The purple squares are ones that are already announced, and those blue ones are ones that have already been approved by the relevant regulatory authorities. This includes air authorities like us, as well as public service commissions that have to make sure they have a reliable source of energy. So this also scaled by size. You can see a whole lot of them coming upwind of us. So we do anticipate that coming, continuing through 2035. And this is a map of that modeling domain again. This is one that I put together. So this is based on the 2017 NEI, showing map sources within that same modeling domain upwind of us. And I put this together just so that we can compare. Here's the Louisville area. And here's what it looks like in the 2028 portion of that modeling. You can see a whole lot of red peeking out from behind that blue. Those red ones are the ones that you can still see that are shutting down. On the whole, we are anticipating a good number of closures directly upwind of us, or at least additional controls placed on. And this is actually a graph from that MPSG recommended spreadsheet showing 2017 in blue, 2023 in red, and 2028 in yellow. There are a couple of large sources that are projected to continue and take up some of the slack as others close down. But you can see from that third set down, starting with the large source upwind of us, and continuing down with TVA, and they even projected some closures at LG&E Mill Creek. They haven't announced those yet, so we don't know how accurate those modeling projections are, but we do anticipate that trend to continue down. And I'll pass it off to Michelle.
All right, thank you, Byron. That was a great deep dive into those upwind sources, and some of that, I think, was some good news for us. So some of the other questions that we heard last month, and which often come up in big picture air quality discussions, were around the air quality effects of land development and tree canopy loss. This is an important aspect of air quality that is affected by air pollution sources that are not included in the permitting of stationary sources, the regular business of most of the district's functions, and the subject of a lot of what we just heard about. Next slide, please, Byron. So land use and air quality is a really broad topic, but I thought it might be helpful to highlight a few key concepts to keep in mind when thinking about how land use can impact air quality and in turn, public health. The potential for health impacts from air pollution is determined, of course, by how much and of what pollutant a person is exposed to. The concentration and duration of that exposure is a function of what and how much is emitted, but also a person's proximity to the sources, the area's meteorology, and even the morphology of the environment that surrounds them. There are many, many ways that land use and land cover changes affect air quality or our exposure to poor air quality. So a few examples of land uses that generate air pollution include manufacturing and energy facilities. Those are stationary sources that are likely to require permits from regulators like APCD. But there are also land uses that generate mobile source emissions like roads and airports or logistics centers. And then there are also many ways that land use and land cover can affect our exposure to air pollution too. For example, when land development results in residential areas being adjacent directly to land uses that generate air pollution, or when land cover changes due to the elimination of tree canopy or green space and there is an expansion of impervious surfaces. As Rachel reminded us at the beginning of this presentation, ozone specifically is a pollutant that forms regionally rather than at the point of that emissions generating activity. But land use planning can absolutely affect the factors leading to ozone formation. From increased mobile source emissions of ozone precursors, those NOx and VOC emissions, to heat impacts from tree canopy loss and the resulting increased energy use for cooling needs. So today we're just going to touch on a few key regulatory processes that can affect land use decision making. Next slide, please. So the most influential regulations when it comes to land use decisions in Louisville is the Land Development Code, or LDC. The LDC is a regulatory document that has been created to implement the goals, objectives, and policies that are set forth in Louisville Metro's comprehensive plan. That's known as Plan 2040. It was recently updated from Cornerstone 2020. So that's a long-range look at what we want to plan our community to look like, in this case, in the horizon year of 2040. The code provides the requirements that are related to zoning, form districts, land use, building and site design, transportation, landscaping, and even signage. And much like the authority for a county to act as an air pollution control district that is found in Kentucky Revised Statutes, or KRS, Chapter 77, KRS Chapter 100 authorizes counties and cities to enact regulations associated with the use, design, operation, and impact of land use activities. The Land Development Code is the enactment of this authority, and its provisions are approved by the appointed Planning Commission and ultimately Metro Council. Included among the many provisions of the LDC are there those that guide the process for reviewing and approving development applications, those that define and set zoning, and those that lay out tree canopy and landscaping requirements by development type. Next slide, and we'll step through a few of those. So within the development review process, there is the potential for a required air quality analysis. This role for APCD in the review process is laid out in provisions found in chapters 5 and 6 of the Land Development Code. Projects that meet certain criteria, for example, those of a certain size or of an estimated traffic impact, may need to perform a traffic impact study and possibly an air quality analysis. This is a modeling activity and is screening for traffic impacts that may cause congestion and ultimately a carbon monoxide hotspot from accumulated vehicle emissions. So a good example would be a development that causes congestion from cars queuing in to make a left turn into a new subdivision. If those impacts are found, the developer may be required to include improvements in their plan to alleviate those conditions, such as a dedicated turn lane or an additional access point into the new development. This LDC provision actually originated from our area's non-attainment designation for carbon monoxide back in the 70s and 80s. And while the vehicle technologies and cleaner fuels have reduced the concern around carbon monoxide greatly, this provision does still occasionally require traffic improvements to avoid localized areas of high carbon monoxide concentrations. So the receptor in this case might be a person on the sidewalk near that intersection. And these traffic improvements are put in place to ensure that that receptor wouldn't be exposed to air quality that exceeds the NAAQS, in this case, the carbon monoxide standard. Next slide, please. And then zoning, got a little lag. There it is. Zoning is enacted through the Land Development Code and is used to regulate property use. So the Land Development Code uses property designations like R4 or C1. Those are types of residential or commercial, for example, zoning types. And those describe allowable uses on a specific property. So this map shows the placement of those various zoning types throughout the county. And there's a key there to help you, match up the colors with the types of property use and zoning. Those zoning designations, along with form districts, describe the allowable uses, the housing density, and the building size and location within each of those zoning designations. So you need to know both the zoning and the form district designation for a property to understand how it can be developed. And it is this regulatory framework that largely determines where the emission sources that APCD regulates go within the city. Give me another click, Byron. There we go. In this version of the zoning map, you can see the red, yellow, and blue dots that represent facilities with air pollution permits. As you can see, these are largely found in industrial or commercial and EZ1 or enterprise zone designations. Next slide, please. The Land Development Code also includes tree canopy and landscaping requirements, including minimum tree canopy requirements by land use type. So within those zoning and districts that were defined in that previous map, there are particular minimum tree canopy requirements that developments must meet. Louisville Metro Council also passed a strengthened street tree ordinance at the end of 2017 and has funded a community forestry program to increase planting and tree maintenance on public rights of way. So here what we see is the prevalence of tree canopy across Louisville Metro. Those are the dark green areas in this map. The map also shows the concentration of impervious surfaces, the buildings, parking lots, and roads. Those are the pink areas. The Land Development Code affects this picture because it lays out those tree canopy percentages required. It also lays out parking requirements, so that may affect the impervious surfaces as well. So there are lots of things that affect this picture, but the Land Development Code has a really strong role to play here. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight a recent land development equity review process. It occurred in 2020. That resulted in more than 40 recommendations across 3 phases, including some that call upon APCD reviews. APCD included our multi-pollutant stakeholder group recommendations in our feedback during the process for forming these reform recommendations, and this is absolutely reflected in the plan going forward. The particular example recommendation on your slide is in phase 3. That's the longest term phase of the plan, and that's because this framework for a review like what is recommended here doesn't yet exist in the Land Development Code and will take some time to develop and implement. Louisville Metro Planning and Design Services, the department responsible for administering the policies, programs, and regulations that guide Metro's development, is currently taking the phase 1 recommendations through the review process. But we'll absolutely keep the board apprised as recommendations that include the district's work move forward through this. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just wanted to mention a transportation planning process that is also very related to land use, transportation conformity. It's required by the Clean Air Act, and it ensures that federal funding and approval are given to highway and transit projects that are consistent with or conform to the air quality goals established by a state air quality implementation plan, what we know as our SIP. Conformity in terms of the SIP means that transportation activities will not cause new air quality violations, worsen existing violations, or delay timely attainment of the national ambient air quality standards. So APCD staff work with transportation planners at our Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, that's known as KIPTA, the Kentuckiana Regional Planning and Development Agency, another great acronym for our lexicon. So KIPTA, to model those projects in the transportation plan. And the plan covers 5 counties. And then they estimate the resulting emissions to ensure that those projects will not exceed emissions budgets that are included in our area's SIP. Right now, we are modeling and comparing against budgets that were set for the 97 ozone standard, but upcoming planning requirements will lead to the establishment of new budgets under the current 2015 ozone standard. Again, more to come on that work in the months ahead. So with that, I'll turn this back over to Director Hamilton. Thank you.
So Chairman Hilton, are there questions from the board?
First, thank you, Michelle and Byron, for a very excellent detailed presentation. Are there any questions or comments from board members regarding this presentation?
I have a few.
Yes.
This is regards to some of the graphics from Director Hamilton's stuff, and I probably should know the answer to this, but on the 8-hour ozone maximum and design values through September, I noticed, and it's true on several of these, there's 7 sites that are listed, but you referenced 9 on the map. And I'm not so sure they are supposed to correlate, but that's a question I have about the representation of the sites in the graph and the sites on the map or the table. Does that make
So
sense?
we have trucks.
If you look at that
Right,
one's
so
got
I think what you're,
7, and then your map's got 9.
go back.
You know what I mean?
Billy, which one's?
And I did not go through which ones are missing or why they're missing, and maybe they're not.
Billy
Could you elevate, right, could you elevate Billy to move for us?
Not all of these
I'm
sites.
counting.
Okay,
So there are 9 sites in the area total. Only 7 of them monitor ozone.
Okay.
I know that Durrett Lane monitors one that doesn't monitor ozone, and I'm not sure the other. If Billy gets promoted, he'll know right offhand.
so that's the answer,
Yeah.
because they don't all do ozone. Okay, that's all I need to know. And then the
Okay.
other question related to the map that represented reformulated gas requirements in Kentucky. It had nothing in Indiana, but you had mentioned another type of measure that Indiana uses.
Right,
Could you clarify that a little bit? And then,
I can.
okay,
Thank you. So as part of that 1997 ozone designation as a non-attainment area, we were moderate. And the requirement to use a specialized blend of gasoline, because at the time, gasoline is much cleaner today. So gasoline was a lot more polluting in terms of volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides back in 1997 in comparison to reformulated gas and another type of cleaner gasoline called Reed vapor pressure gas. On a scale, you have conventional gas down here. Reed vapor pressure gas is less polluting and cleaner than conventional gas, and RFG is cleaner than both. So our area was using the cleanest type of fuel to reduce our ozone here locally. And that's because at the time, the governor opted into reformulated gas. And as a result, when we were required to implement that mobile source control measure, RFG, rather than RVP or Reed vapor pressure gas, is used here. IDEM does continue to, as APCD does, see the use of that cleaner gasoline as a necessary control measure, particularly while our combined metropolitan statistical area is in non-attainment. And does that help answer your question?
it does, and I have a follow-up more from, this is for illustration purposes. You look, as a layperson, if you look at this map, you're saying Indiana doesn't do anything, and we're bearing the burden as Jefferson County and small areas in Bullitt and, I guess, Oldham. Can a graph or a map like this illustrate in a different color maybe what Indiana does, so there's a representation that they are doing something beyond just regular gas?
Absolutely.
That makes sense?
Yes.
Let's just put this map together in the past couple of days.
Okay.
We've only had a description up till now that was very hard to go through. With visual information, I'm sure we can talk to Ben about adding a green over Clark and Floyd County to represent their.
Because the impression that you get is we're bearing the burden.
Mhm.
Well,
And
and
that
again,
means- True.
keep in mind too, that this is the RFG area. And certainly we
Right.
can go through and add one that shows mobile source gasoline controls, and we will add in the portions of Indiana that are using RVP, Reed vapor pressure gas. I do want to let folks know that Billy has indicated that Algonquin Parkway and Durrett Lane do not measure ozone.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And I have the last question for Ms. King. On the land development code in APCD's review responsibilities, does it ever extend beyond traffic? I mean, could it go to things like tree canopy requirements? Because obviously they're affecting air quality. Or is that the bridge too
Right.
far?
Those aren't currently provisions of the land development code, though the recommendations in the reform process do imagine greater input from Air Pollution Control District, as well as Office of Advanced Planning and Sustainability, MSD, the Health Department, and others related to other types of environmental reviews. So that could certainly be added. I will also just say that during the course of the revision of the land development code tree canopy requirements, there have been a couple rounds over the past 10 years or so, and at each turn, APCD had staff very hands-on in that process, really trying to represent that air quality impact and discussion point around tree canopy and the way it affects air quality. So while we didn't have necessarily a regulatory role in that process, going forward in development review, we absolutely have been representing APCD's interests in the development of those requirements. And those tree canopy percentages required by land use type were recently increased following the 2015 tree canopy assessment.
And I know there's some controversy over some site or some plans being approved that kind of fell outside those criteria. And
right,
anyway.
the Planning Commission does have some waiver authority, and I know there was also discussion of that during the revision of those to try to make sure that in cases where sites may have some of those requirements reduced or waived, that the tree canopy requirements were met either in adjacent areas or in other areas of need, or that there was a monetary amount assigned to be paid into the community forestry's funding. So those can happen. That's absolutely, like you said, a point of discussion and contention.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments from board members?
I have a quick question for Michelle. That concerns map showing different types of areas for development. In particular, I was curious about the enterprise zones and how that is defined, and whether permitting of new sources in those areas is different than other areas, say normal residential areas.
Right. Enterprise zones were identified over many years, I believe, and Rachel can definitely hop in on some of this with some more background. But those enterprise zones allow for a variety of land uses. I think that it was seen as an economic development tool when that classification was created and implemented through the zoning regulations. So there are easy areas that may include both industrial and residential land uses. That's absolutely something that was seen and discussed through the equity review of the land development code. Those arise to some serious environmental justice considerations. And there are recommendations in the reform process to look at how to better keep those land uses that really conflict with each other further apart, to not approve residential in an easy zone that includes industrial or vice versa. Rachel, do you want to add to that as well?
You've done an excellent job. Candidly, Dr. Coburn, I really appreciate you raising that question. It is of concern to APCD in particular because it allows for a wide variety of uses that are permitted as of right next to residential areas that elsewhere in the county are not permitted without a conditional use permit. So it streamlines the development process, but there's also a part of the conditional use process, public involvement in particular, that's eliminated. So it is something that we've raised as a concern from our standpoint, and hope that as we go through that land development equity process, it's one that we raise and have a robust discussion on as a community for the reasons that Michelle has explained. It's an environmental justice concern from our standpoint.
Are any of those enterprise zones federally mandated? What discretion does Louisville Metro have on that designation?
That's an excellent question, and I think that's one that we'll have to leave to our land development colleagues to help us understand. My understanding of the process is that it is something that was federally allowed and then implemented by the General Assembly. So I'm not sure how that process changes going forward, if it changes. So again, that land development equity review that our colleagues at Planning and Design are undertaking, part and parcel, that is an important part of helping APCD with our air quality goals of reducing exposure. That is just hand in hand work we're going to have to do together, understanding that they are the leaders on how the land development code operates.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, Michelle and Rachel and Baron. Moving along,
It looks like we have a raised hand.
who have raised hand?
Andy, are you able to unmute Ms. Gadsden? Since it looks like you have a question.
It looks like actually I do not have unmute available for her, but I will. Let me do this. Her audio options were not showing up. Let's see if they appear here in the. There we go. You should be able to speak now, Arnita.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, basically, I think Rachel just answered my question that I had, and plus I just wanted to see if my raised hand would work since it never has been able to do that. So, but Rachel, I think you asked the question, and and if you didn't, just if you had something else to add because of what I'm getting ready to say, and is that we don't have a solid date, or we don't have a time period in which that environmental justice issue will be dealt with in the land development code. Is that what you were basically saying there?
It's my understanding, Arnita, that it's to be considered in phase 3 of the equity work. And the land development code equity work is being done under direction from Louisville Metro Council. So, this is a process where they, I believe, are very mindful of the need for this work to proceed.
Okay, so we don't have.
I'll just add that there are some recommendations around Easy One in phase 2. My understanding is phase 2 hasn't begun yet, but I think they're looking at it in kind of a piece by piece approach.
Okay, and we don't have any idea when this may happen, or when the next meeting, or the process. I mean, have they set a goal for themselves, or they're just going along to get on?
There are timeframes associated with those phases of the reform recommendations. They are not set with dates. So, for example, the phase 1 recommendations were set to be implemented in the 6 months plus timeframe. Phase 2 in the 12 to 18 months, and then phase 3 in the 24 and further out months. So And I don't know if those timeframes only apply to the development of those revisions, because of course the revision approval process has a timeframe of its own, and that can really depend on these things moving through Planning Commission and Metro Council.
Okay.
And Arnita, as we move forward with that process with our partners and planning and design, we will use the board meeting to keep the board informed of our collaborative work there. So that'll be another place where we can help share the information as it becomes known about when those meetings will take place.
Okay.
So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and I think it would be good if you could, you know, on my community meetings, if you have some additional information, it would be a good time to share that, whether I ask for it or not, because I won't know. But you know me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Or any other questions or comments from board members? Any questions from the public regarding this presentation? If not, the next thing on the agenda is our quality data. Are there any questions, comments regarding the our quality data, PM 2.5 ozone, was covered quite well. Next one is the enforcement status report. Any questions, comments? The next report is the excess emission report. Any questions or comments on that? Just one page on that one. And the last one is the complaint and investigation status report. We've got 11 pages on this report. Quite long. It's interesting when you read this. People are burning wire for copper and stuff. It's interesting, this report. Thank you very much. Any questions from the board members on any of these reports? I will now adjourn this regular meeting of the board and thank you for your participation. The next board meeting is Wednesday, October the 20th at 10 a.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks to all the presenters. Bye-bye.